The first thing Harlan Wallace noticed about the woman at the edge of his property was not her tusks, not her green skin darkened like old copper in the fading afternoon light, and not the way her hand gripped the split-rail fence as if she might fall without it. The first thing he noticed was the blood soaking through the left side of her leather vest in a slow, dark bloom that told him she had maybe an hour before the decision was made for both of them. He had been splitting wood when she appeared, materializing out of the pine tree line that bordered the eastern pasture, moving with the particular kind of determination that belongs to people who are running on the last reserves of will they possess. The axe came down, the log split clean, and Harlan straightened and watched her come across his field without calling out, without reaching for the rifle leaning against the woodpile. He was 32 years old and had lived alone on this homestead at the edge of the Grayville frontier for 6 of those years, long enough to read trouble the way a farmer reads weather. And what he read in this woman was not danger pointed outward, but danger pointed inward, the kind that consumed its host. She wore travel leathers that had seen hard miles, a fitted dark brown bodice laced tightly up the front over a deep green blouse with a cinched waist, snug riding trousers tucked into short boots reinforced at the toe and heel with hammered iron studs. A wide leather belt crossed her hips and carried a sheathed short blade on the left and an empty knife loop on the right, the strap cut clean where something had been taken or lost. Her black hair was braided back in 2 thick ropes that had come half undone, strands falling across a face that carried the strong bones of an orc warrior alongside something else entirely. A fullness of lip, a depth of dark amber eye, a curve of jaw that was, beneath the road grime and the pain, striking in the way wild country is striking, with a beauty that earns its looking. She stopped about 10 feet from him and stood in the long grass of his yard, and the two of them regarded each other in the particular silence that exists between a human and an orc on the frontier, a silence with its own history and weight and the ghosts of 2 generations of war inside it. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, and her voice was low and measured, the voice of someone who had given this line before to people who did not believe it. "I can see that," Harlan said. "You are here because you are about to fall down." She looked at him for a long moment, and something behind her amber eyes shifted, recalculated, as if she had prepared herself for hostility and was now having to reread the terrain entirely. "I need water," she said, "and then I will go." "You need stitching," he said, nodding at the blood. "Water comes second to stitching." He picked up the axe, drove it into the chopping block with a single practice swing, and turned toward the cabin without waiting to see if she would follow. She did follow, 3 steps behind, and he noticed that she did not make a sound when she walked despite the wound, an old discipline written into the way she moved, and he noted it and said nothing. The cabin was low and solid, built from pine logs with a stone hearth that took up most of the north wall, a plank table with 2 mismatched chairs, shelves stocked with preserves and dry goods, and a rope bed in the corner with a wool blanket folded at the foot. It smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, and the dried herbs that hung in bundles from the ceiling beams. He pulled a stool to the table, gestured at it, and went to the medicine chest on the shelf beside the hearth. "Sit," he said. She sat, which told him more than anything else had, because it meant the pain had finally overruled the pride. He worked in silence, cutting away the leather with his skinning knife to expose the wound, a long, shallow slash along her left ribs that had bled profusely but had not found anything vital, the kind of wound a blade makes when the body it was meant for moved at the last possible instant. She did not flinch when he cleaned it with strong spirits, though her jaw tightened once and her hand flattened on the table edge with controlled force. He stitched it with the small curved needle he kept for exactly this kind of business, because the frontier was not a place that allowed squeamishness about other people's bodies, and he had stitched his own forearm twice and his neighbor's shoulder once and had long ago made his peace with it. When he finished, he tied off the last stitch and sat back, and she looked down at the neat row of stitching along her ribs with an expression he could not fully read. "You have done that before," she said. "A few times." He washed his hands in the basin, dried them on a cloth. "What is your name?" She looked at him again with that recalculating quality. "Why?" "Because I would like to call you something other than she," he said simply. There was a pause, and then she said, "Mazoga Thunderroar." "Harlan Wallace," he said. "This is my land." "I know," she said. "The trapper at the river crossing told me you were a man who did not shoot at things before he knew what they were." "Good advice to give. Good reputation to keep," she answered, and for the first time something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one moved across her face. He gave her water and then heated broth over the fire and set a bowl in front of her, and she took it with both hands and drank without being asked again, and he understood from that she had been running long enough to be beyond the point of performance. She was just hungry and hurt, and she let herself be fed because there was nothing left for theater. He did not ask about the wound. He did not ask about who had made it, or why she was alone, or where her clan had gone. He had scars of his own on his forearms, and across his left shoulder that he did not particularly want to explain to strangers, so he extended the same courtesy. She had scars she would not talk about. He could see that clearly thin old lines on her knuckles and along the right side of her jaw, and a larger one at her collarbone that was years old and fully healed, and he decided then that he would not ask about them. A person's scars were the pages of a book they had not chosen to publish, and he did not read other people's private books. She stayed that night in the barn because she refused to take the bed, and he did not argue because he could see she needed the walls around her more than she needed the mattress. He brought her a second blanket and a lantern turned low, and she took both without comment. He walked back to the cabin in the cold autumn dark and sat in the chair by the hearth for a long time, thinking about the frontier and about war, and about the way her hands had looked around that bowl, large and capable and briefly, just briefly, trembling. In the morning she was still there, which surprised him more than he let show. She had already been up before dawn. He could tell by the fresh tracks in the mud around the well, and she was sitting on the fence at the edge of the yard, facing east toward the tree line she had come from, with an expression that was measuring something he could not see. He made coffee in the iron pot and brought 2 cups out and set one on the fence post beside her without a word and went back to the morning's work. He had a fence line down on the north pasture, and a plow horse with a stone bruise and a roof section that needed re-shingling before the first real snow, which the sky had been threatening for a week. He went about it systematically, the way he went about everything. She appeared at the woodpile mid-morning, took up the second axe without asking, and began splitting. She worked with efficiency and force, the kind of physical capability that comes from a lifetime of hard use, and she matched his pace and then exceeded it and did not look to him for acknowledgement. He did not give any. He simply worked alongside her and let the rhythm of the labor be what it was. At noon, he found that she had questions she never asked. He knew this because he watched her in the way a person who lives alone learns to watch the world, with the whole of his attention without making it visible, and he saw her eyes move to things: the calendar on the wall with its frontier settlement dates, the pair of boots by the door too small for him, the second chair, the faded square on the shelf where something had stood for years and then been taken away. She looked at all of these things with the careful attention of someone assembling a picture, and she never asked a single question about any of it. She assembled what she could from what was visible and kept the rest to herself, and he found that he respected this profoundly. The boots had been his wife's. The faded square had been a portrait. She had died of fever 4 winters ago, in the second year they had been here, before the homestead was really more than a hope hammered into the ground, and he had buried her on the slope behind the cabin where the wild columbine grew in spring. He had not spoken of it to anyone in 2 years, and he did not speak of it now. By the 3rd day it had become something with a shape to it, though neither of them had named the shape. She worked with him because she needed, he understood, to earn the food and shelter rather than be given it, and he let her because the work was real and needed doing, And because he had learned that pride was the currency of survival on the frontier, and you did not take it from people without cost. She fixed the fence line with a speed and accuracy that told him she had built things before, had worked with her hands at practical construction, and she knew how to work a post hole in frozen ground in a way that suggested she had done it in much harder conditions than this. In the evenings they sat near the hearth, and the silence between them was different from the first evening's silence. It had lost its history and its weight, or rather the history and weight were still there, but they had been set to one side, and what remained was a quiet that was almost companionable. On the fourth evening, while the wind picked up outside and drove the first real cold against the cabin walls, Mazoga said, "You are going to ask me to leave." Harlan looked up from the harness he was mending. "I am not." She watched him. "Everyone asks." "I am not everyone," he said, and went back to the harness. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, in a voice that was careful and level in the way that carefully level voices usually are when covering something underneath, "I was with a war band. We were hired to patrol the Grayville borderlands for a merchant company. The company decided at the end of the season that paying dead men was cheaper than paying live ones." She paused. "There were 3 of us who got away. I do not know where the other 2 went." Harlan set the harness down. He looked at her across the firelight, this woman with her old scars and her amber eyes and her careful voice. "That is a cowardly thing the company did," he said. "It is a common thing," she said. "Common and cowardly are not mutually exclusive," he said. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated and sharp and something under it that was unexpectedly open. "No," she agreed. "They are not." He picked the harness back up. "You can stay until the wound is fully closed," he said. "After that it is up to you." She did not say thank you. He did not need her to. He had noticed that she did not give gratitude in the conventional currency of words, but that she expressed it through presence and labor and the particular quality of her attention, and he found that this suited him better than the words would have anyway, because he was not a man who received gratitude comfortably. The wound closed in 10 days, which was fast, but he had observed that orcs healed at a pace that made human physicians grouse with professional envy, and so he was not surprised. She was careful with herself in the meantime in the way people are careful when they know that a body is a tool and tools require maintenance, and on the 10th day she looked at the stitching and said, "These can come out." He took them out with small, precise cuts, and his fingers were close to her ribs, and the warmth of her skin was a thing he registered with a kind of involuntary attention that he then firmly redirected. She was watching his face while he worked, and he kept his expression neutral and professional, and when he finished, she pulled her blouse back down and said nothing, and he went to wash his hands again. 11 days. 12. The first real snow came. Not a dusting but a proper frontier snow that came in overnight and covered everything to the knees by morning. He woke to find her already outside, digging out the well cover and the path to the barn, moving through the white with the practiced calm of someone who had lived through northern winters. She did not leave. Neither of them said anything about this. December came in with teeth. The temperature dropped in the nights to the kind of cold that killed livestock and cracked plank walls, and found every draft in a cabin's thinking. Harlan kept the fire burning around the clock and brought additional wood in from the pile and banked the hearth carefully before sleep. On the 3rd night of the deep cold, he woke at some dark hour to find the fire burned low and the cabin genuinely cold, cold enough that the water in the basin had skinned over with ice, and he got up and rebuilt the fire and sat close to it, and after a moment he said, without turning around, "There is room by the fire." There was a pause, and then the rope bed creaked and he heard her cross the floor, and she sat on the other side of the hearthstone, close enough that they were both within the fire's warmth, and they sat like that without speaking while the fire rebuilt itself and the ice on the basin cracked and receded. "What is it you are thinking about?" he asked eventually, because he had noticed she was not looking at the fire but through it. "The river crossing," she said. "In spring." She paused. "The rivers out of these mountains run very high in the thaw." "They do," he agreed. "I have crossed them before, going north." Another pause. I do not always know what I am going north toward." He understood the shape of what she was saying without her saying it directly, which was that she was telling him about rootlessness, about the particular exhaustion of a life spent moving through a world that did not make room for you, and that she was telling him this not as a complaint but as a fact, because she was a person who dealt in facts. "I came here from a homestead further south," he said, "after my wife died." He had not intended to say that, or rather he had intended to say it eventually but had not expected it to be now, at this dark hour by the rebuilt fire. But there it was. The southern homestead had too many of her in it, every wall. I could not breathe. Mazoga looked at him with that amber gaze, direct and without performance. "How long ago?" "4 years, nearly 5, he looked at the fire. "The grief does not leave, but it changes. It becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I had a daughter. She was 3 years old, the war." She did not finish the sentence. He did not ask her to finish it. He sat with what she had said and let it have its full weight, which was the only honest thing to do with something like that. After a while he said simply, "I am sorry." "Yes," she said, and it was not an acknowledgement of his condolence but an agreement with the fact of it, the way a person agrees with an accurate assessment of the weather. "It was terrible." "Yes." They sat by the fire until the cabin was warm again, and then she went back to the bed, and he went back to his bedroll on the floor by the hearth where he had been sleeping to give her the bed, and neither of them said anything more that night. But something had shifted in the house the way things shift after truth is spoken in the dark. And in the morning the silence between them had a different texture, warmer and more honest, the silence of people who have trusted each other with something real. January was long and hard and kept them close to the homestead, which meant they were in each other's company more hours of the day than not, and Harlan began to learn the specific geography of Mazoga Thunderroar. He learned that she woke before dawn every morning as a matter of old habit she could not and did not try to break. He learned that she read when she thought no one was watching, working through his small shelf of books with the focused appetite of someone who had been denied access to books for long stretches of time. He learned that she had a particular talent for the mechanical and the structural, that she could look at a broken thing and understand its break in a way that went beyond what most people could see, and that she took a quiet satisfaction in fixing things that was as close to pleasure as he had yet seen on her face. He learned that she sometimes stood outside in the cold without a coat, particularly on days when something was sitting on her, some memory or grief, and that the cold seemed to do for her what whiskey did for other people, burn through the noise and leave a kind of clarity. He learned to leave her to it on those days. He was also, with increasing clarity, learning other things about her that he did not entirely want to examine, or rather he was willing to examine them. He was not a man who avoided his own interior, but they were things that required a careful approach. He was aware of her in the physical sense with a sharpness that had been building since the second week, and was now a fairly constant background presence. The way she moved was part of it, the easy, powerful economy of her body, the way she carried herself with a directness that had no vanity in it. Her voice was another part, low and measured, and when it carried something other than measure, when she was absorbed in a problem or briefly amused, it had a warmth in it that hit him somewhere behind the sternum. Her face was another thing entirely, a face that rewarded looking, strong and amber-eyed and surprising. He was aware that she was an orc and he was human, and he was aware of what the town of Grayville would have to say about that, and what the frontier settlement at large would have to say about it, and what the men who ran the trading post, and the men who sat at the bar at Calden's saloon, and the women who traded gossip at the dry goods store would have to say about it. He was aware of all of this, and he had been sitting with it for weeks, and his honest conclusion was that the opinions of Calden's saloon crowd were worth approximately the same as the opinions of the wood he was splitting, which was nothing at all. The more complicated thing was whether Mazoga felt anything at all in his direction, and he was not a man who assumed. One evening in late January, she was at the table with his copy of The Practical Frontier Surveyor, which was not exactly thrilling reading, but she had worked through every other book on the shelf, and he had the suspicion she would have read a wagon manifest cover to cover if that was what was available. He was at the hearth with a small carving he had been working at for weeks, a rough horse for no particular reason, except that his hands needed something to do in the evenings. He made some observation about the survey methods described in the book. She countered it with a specific critique, and they were 20 minutes into a genuine argument about land measurement and the unreliability of the surveyor's tools available on the frontier before he realized she was smiling. Not just the near smile he had seen a few times, but a real one, full and unguarded, and it was so unexpectedly beautiful that he lost the thread of what he was saying entirely. She noticed. Of course she noticed because she was a woman who noticed everything. She looked at him with the sharp amber eyes and then looked down at the book. "You stopped mid-sentence," she said. "I got distracted," he said. "By what?" "Nothing important," he said, which was entirely untrue, and they both knew it, and neither of them pushed further, but when he went asleep that night the smile was still behind his eyes. February brought a thaw and then a second hard freeze, and during the thaw Harlan hitched the wagon and drove to Grayville for supplies. He had considered asking Mazoga if she wanted to come, and then had considered what the town would do with that, and decided against it. And he felt bad about the decision in a way that sat uneasily with him the whole drive in. Grayville was a rough-edged frontier settlement, 24 buildings, and a population of approximately 300 who had come here from various points south looking for cheap land or a fresh start, or to escape something they preferred not to name. It had a trading post, a smithy, a mill, a livery, a church, a physician who drank too much, and Calden's, which was the saloon and the informal government of the town simultaneously. Harlan did his business at the trading post efficiently, and had gathered most of what he needed when old Aldous Bent, who served behind the counter and had opinions about everything under the sky, said, "Heard you got an orc at your place." Harlan set his flour order on the counter. "I have a hired hand." "That is what people are saying," Aldous said, in the tone that indicates people are saying nothing of the sort. A warband orc, wounded, came out of the eastern trees. Torben's boy saw her from the road. "Torben's boy should stay on Torben's road," Harlan said pleasantly. "People are worried, Harlan." "People were worried when I dug my well too close to the pasture and the water came up muddy. People were worried when the Denholm girl married the Miller boy because he was from the Southern Territories. People worry about things that are not their business as a form of entertainment." He counted out coins for the flour. "She is a hired hand. She works hard and keeps to herself. If anyone comes to my land to make it their business, they will find I have a rifle that shoots straight and a disposition that has very little patience for trespass." Aldous took the coins without further comment, which was probably the best outcome available, and Harlan loaded the wagon and drove home through the late afternoon's pale gold light. He told her about it that evening matter-of-factly because she deserved to know and because secrets had a way of becoming walls. She listened with her hands flat on the table and her expression controlled, and at the end she said, "You defended me." "Yes," he said. "You do not have to," she said. "It creates trouble for you." "Mazoga," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name with that particular directness, just her name with nothing attached to it as a statement in itself, and she looked at him. "I'm not interested in doing only what I have to do." She held his gaze for a moment that went on slightly longer than the strictly conversational, and then she looked at the fire, and he noticed that her jaw was tight and her hands on the table were very still. "You have questions," he said, "that you do not ask." She turned to look at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I have watched you for 2 months," he said, and kept his voice mild. "You look at things, you notice things. You work things out from what you can see, you never ask." She was quiet for a moment. "Asking creates obligation," she said. If I ask, then you know what I want to know, then I owe something for the information. That is a hard way to live, he said. It is a safe way to live, she replied. It is a lonely way to live, he said gently. She looked at him again, and this time there was something unguarded in her face that she did not quite manage to put back in time, something that looked like being seen and not sure how to manage the fact of it. Yes, she said, and the word was quiet and honest and had a lot under it. He did not press further that night. But the conversation had named something that both of them knew was there, and in the days that followed something began to change. She asked him a question on a Thursday, a small one about the history of the homestead. He answered it. She asked another about the Columbine slope behind the cabin, just its name. He told her about it, and she listened with the full quality of her attention, and he answered her honestly. She had more questions. He had more answers. And slowly, like ice at the edge of a river when the thaw is real, the careful self-containment she had built around herself began to loosen, not collapsing but easing, and underneath it was a person who was curious about everything and deeply perceptive and quietly funny, and who had opinions about land and freedom, and the way societies organized themselves that were sharply considered, and often pointed directly at the places most people preferred not to look. He was, with increasing certainty, in very serious trouble, and it was the best kind. The snow was still on the ground in the first week of March when a man came to the homestead from Grayville. His name was Deeks Horan, and he ran the settlement's loosely organized frontier patrol, a self-appointed role that he took very seriously, and he rode up the track to the cabin with 2 other men behind him, and the particular posture of someone who has decided he is doing his civic duty. Harlan came out onto the steps when he heard the horses, and Mazoga appeared at the corner of the barn behind him, which he noticed from the way Horan's eyes moved. He positioned himself slightly in front of the cabin door and watched them come. "Wallace," Horan said from horseback, "I will be direct with you." "Please," Harlan said. "There is a group of men in town who are of the opinion that an armed orc warrior residing in the Homestead district is an unacceptable risk to the community. Given the recent borderland trouble with the Iron Joe clan movement, they feel." "Who are the men?" Harlan asked. Horan listed 3 names. Harlan recognized all of them as men who had never themselves done anything about the borderland trouble and who did their civic duty primarily from the bar at Calden's. "She is not Iron Joe," Harlan said. "She has no clan connection. She is a hired hand on my private land." He kept his voice steady and his posture easy and his hands visible, which was the specific presentation of a man who was not going to be moved. "I did not call for a patrol presence on my homestead, and I do not require one. If there is a genuine legal question about the residency of my employees, I will take it up with the actual territorial authority in Westhome, not with a group of concerned citizens at a saloon." Horan's jaw worked. "Harlan, nobody is saying." "I know what nobody is saying," Harlan said. "I have lived in this territory for 6 years, and I know exactly what is being said, and I know exactly who is saying it, and I want you to carry this back to them precisely. She stays. This is my land. If anyone has further concerns, they are welcome to take them to Westhome, and I will meet them there." One of the men behind Horan shifted in his saddle, and his horse moved, and the movement brought him a few feet closer to the barn corner, and therefore a few feet closer to Mazoga. Harlan moved off the step, just one measured step into the yard, putting himself clearly and physically between the man on horseback and the woman at the barn corner, and he did not raise his hands or his voice. He simply placed himself there with a deliberateness that was impossible to misread. The man pulled his horse back. Horan looked at Harlan for a long moment, and then at Mazoga, and then back at Harlan, and Harlan could see him working through the calculus of whether this was worth it and arriving at the accurate conclusion that it was not. "You are making things difficult for yourself," Horan said, but it was the tone of a retreating argument, not an advancing one. "I have always found the right things to be difficult," Harlan said pleasantly. They left. Harlan stood in the yard and watched them go until the sound of the horses was gone, and then he turned and Mazoga was right there, close, having come forward from the barn corner without his noticing, and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not the measuring look and not the near smile, and not the open grief of the night by the fire. It was something else, something more unguarded than any of those, and it made the air between them feel different, charged like the air before a storm. "You stood in front of me," she said, and her voice was quiet. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked at her across the few feet of frozen mud between them. This woman who was scarred and careful and funny and fierce, and who had a dead daughter she did not name and questions she had never asked, and who had fixed his fence line in a blizzard and read, the practical frontier surveyor, by lamplight with the focused appetite of someone reclaiming something they had been denied. He looked at her and he said, "You know why." She held his gaze for a long moment, and neither of them moved, and then she looked away, and the moment broke cleanly, and he turned and went back to the woodpile, and she went back into the barn, and both of them went about the afternoon's work. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, and they both knew it was only a matter of when and how. The when arrived on a Wednesday evening in late March, when the last ice on the yard puddles had given up, and the columbines on the slope behind the cabin were sending up their first tentative green. They were at the table after supper, and she was asking him, genuinely asking this time, about the surveyor's manual, about whether the land measurement methods described in it could be used to formally establish homestead boundaries that would hold up at the territorial level. And he was answering her, and they were both leaning forward over the table and their hands were close together in the lamplight, and she was not wearing the careful distance she usually wore. He reached out and covered her hand with his, gently, with a question in the gesture rather than an assumption. She went very still, not a flinching stillness but a listening one, the way you go still when something you have been waiting for arrives, and you need a moment to confirm that it is real. Then she turned her hand under his and her fingers closed around his, slow and deliberate, and that was all. They sat like that for a while, hands linked on the table, not moving, not saying anything, while the lamplight moved over the wall and the fire settled in the hearth, and it was one of the most extraordinary evenings of Harlan Wallace's life, and he had had some remarkable evenings. "I have more questions," she said eventually, her voice low and very even. "I have more answers," he said. "What are you doing?" she asked, and it was the question underneath all the others, the one she had been carrying since the first week, since he had not reached for the rifle and had stitched her wound and not asked about the scars. "Right now," he said. "Yes. Holding your hand," he said, "and hoping you will let me." She looked at their joined hands on the table and then up at him, and her amber eyes in the lamplight were extraordinary, deep and searching and openly, nakedly honest in a way that he understood was a cost for her, a gift of something she did not give easily. "I am not easy," she said. "I do not want easy," he said. "I am orc. You are human. The town." "The town," he said, "can make its own choices and I will make mine. You have already made your life difficult. Mazoga," he held her gaze. "I am already happier than I have been in 5 years. The difficulty is not a problem." She looked at him for a long, searching moment, and then she said quietly, "I have not known how to ask for things I wanted. For a long time, a pause. I want this, a smaller pause. I wanted to say it directly." "Thank you," he said, "for asking." She almost laughed, which was better than a smile, and he thought he could live very comfortably on that sound for quite a long time. The first kiss was 2 evenings later, no particular occasion, just an evening by the fire after work and supper and real conversation. And he had been sitting beside her rather than across from her because they had gravitated over the past weeks toward proximity. And she said something quietly funny about the surveyor's complete misunderstanding of mountain topography, and he laughed and looked at her. And the closeness was simply there. And so was the moment, and he leaned in, and she met him, and it was careful and warm and real. and she tasted of wood smoke and the herbal tea she had taken to making from the dried bundles on the ceiling beams, and her hand came up and rested, tentatively, against the side of his face, and the gentleness of it, from this woman who had been so careful with herself for so long, undid him completely. They broke apart slowly, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and she said, in that careful level voice that was slightly less steady than usual, "I asked before." Was that asking again? "Yes," he said. "That was very much asking." "Good," she said, and the fullness of the smile she gave him then was something he intended to spend the rest of his life earning. April came, and with it the real thaw and the mad, hectic urgency of spring planting, and the fence repairs the winter had exacted, and the 100 other claims a homestead made on a person's attention in the season's turn. They worked together with the efficiency of people who had been working together for months, and who had also become people who found excuses to pass close to each other, and who occasionally touched hands across the breakfast table in the morning, and who talked, really talked, through the long working days and the evenings after, about everything from topography to the nature of loyalty, to what she had seen on the far side of the eastern mountains in the years before the war that had taken her daughter. She told him about her daughter in pieces, across several weeks, not as a single telling but as the way real grief comes out, in the corners of other conversations, in the middle of something else. Her name had been Urka. She had had her mother's amber eyes and her father's small tusks, and she had liked to collect pebbles from the river. Her father had also died in the war, at a different time from Urka, and Mazoga had been somewhere else when it happened, and the distance between her and the fact of their deaths had a specific and particular texture that he recognized from his own grief, the way survival creates a gap between you and the people you lost that is itself a kind of wound. He listened to all of it. He did not try to resolve it or explain it or make it mean something comfortable. He just sat with her in it when she brought it out, which was what she needed, and afterward she was always quieter for a while and then slowly returned to herself, and he noticed that each time she came back slightly less guarded, as if the telling had taken some weight off that had been pressing against the guard and making it necessary. In May, he drove to Grayville with Mazoga on the wagon seat beside him, and he did not do it quietly or by side roads. He did it on the main track in full daylight, and he nodded to people he knew as he passed, and he helped her down from the wagon in front of the trading post with a hand that was public and unremarkable, and he introduced her, in front of Aldous Bent and 2 other people in the store, as Mazoga, the woman who worked his land. It caused what it caused. He had expected nothing less. There were looks and there was a stiffness, and there were 2 women who turned slightly away. And there was one man at the door who said something under his breath that Harlan heard very clearly, and he turned and looked at the man with a steadiness that communicated very precisely that the next words out of that mouth would be answered with something more than a look, and the man said nothing further. Mazoga stood through all of it with her chin level and her amber eyes quiet and her back straight, and she handed her list to Aldous when asked and spoke clearly, and met every eye that came to her. And she was, in the particular bright outdoor light of the trading post steps with the spring mud and the wagon and the watching eyes, so striking and so completely herself that Harlan had to work to keep his own expression appropriate to the general commerce of the morning. On the way home she was quiet for most of the drive, and then she said, "That was not as bad as it has been." "It will improve," he said. "Or it will not," she said evenly. "Either way," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Either way," she agreed, and there was something in the way she said it that told him she meant both the town and the 2 of them together, and he found that he was in perfect agreement. June was warm and long, and the homestead was, under her hands and his together, more productive than it had been in the years he had worked it alone. She had ideas about the layout of the east field that he had never considered, and that turned out to be right. She built a proper gate for the paddock that swung without dragging, which the previous gate had never done in 6 years. She had started a kitchen garden in a sunny corner behind the cabin, and it was thriving in a way his previous attempts had not because she understood soil and drainage in a way that was both practical and almost intuitive. They were building something together, and both of them knew it, and neither of them had said the words that would make it fully official in their own mouths. The way you sometimes circle something real from the outside for a while to make sure you know it fully before you name it. On a warm evening in late June, they were sitting outside on the top step of the cabin, close together, his shoulder against hers, watching the last of the sunlight move off the western pasture into the tree-lined dark. She had her hand resting on his knee, and he had his arm around her shoulders, and it was so easy and so right that it sat in his chest like a thing that had been there always, and he had just recently found where it lived. "You have scars," she said, not for the first time, but differently. She reached up and touched the scar on his left shoulder through the cloth of his shirt, a question in the touch. He told her about it. A frontier fight early in the years here when the land was still contested by a previous claimant who had made his objections with a blade rather than a legal filing. He told her plainly and simply, and she listened. "I have scars," she said then. "I know," he said. "You never asked." "I know," he said again. "Why?" "Because they were yours," he said. "Because if you wanted me to know what they meant, you would tell me when you were ready. Because the story a person carries in their body is not anyone else's to demand." She was quiet for a moment. "The one on my collarbone," she said, "is from my first real fight. I was 18. She touched it lightly through the fabric of her blouse. I was afraid I was going to die, and instead I lived, and I have never fully decided how to feel about that." "What was on the other side of living?" he asked. "A long road," she said. "A war, a daughter, another war." She paused. "And eventually a fence post in the winter mud." She looked at him, and the amber eyes were soft and direct and alive. "And a man who did not shoot at things before he knew what they were." He looked at her. "Mazoga." "Yes." "I am in love with you," he said plainly. The way he said all of the most important things without ornamentation, because the important things did not need it. She held his gaze for a moment that had weight to it, and then she said, "I know. I have been thinking about it." She paused, and he waited, knowing she needed the pause. "I think I have been in love with you since February. I could not be sure for a while because I was not used to the feeling being safe to have." "Is it safe now?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and it was the most simply honest word he had ever heard. "Yes, it is." He kissed her on the step in the fading light with his hand in her unraveling braid and her hands at his jaw. And it was not the careful first kiss or the tentative growing familiarity of the weeks between, but something fully realized, warm and deep and true, with both of them present in it without reservation. And the summer dark came down around them, and the fireflies began in the grass below the step, and the homestead held them in its quiet working life. That night she did not sleep in the bed, and he did not sleep on the floor by the fire. They lay together in the narrow rope bed with the window open to the warm night, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her. And there was a long, perfect quietness between them in which both of them were simply present and unhurried and held. And he thought about the years he had lived in the echo of loss, and she thought about the years she had lived in the cold necessity of movement. And they held each other in the summer dark like people who had both been a long way from this and were grateful for the arrival. The weeks that followed were the best of Harlan Wallace's life, measured honestly. He had known love before, had known the comfortable certainty of a good marriage, but this was something with more heat and more complexity and more raw realness in it, possibly because both of them had been broken enough to know exactly what they were choosing. She brought herself fully into the life of the homestead and the life between them with the completeness of a decision she had made with her whole person, not just the parts of herself she showed easily. She argued with him and she laughed at him, and she surprised him regularly with the depth and range of what she carried in her mind and her heart, and he fell more thoroughly in love with her on an almost daily basis. She came to him fully, with the warmth and the trust of someone who had made a complete choice, on a night in July when the heat was soft and the lantern was turned low, and the whole long, slow building of everything between them arrived at a place where it could be expressed in the way they had not yet expressed it. Tender and deliberate and completely real, every touch a conversation, every moment earned by everything that had come before it. She was confident and graceful and honest in her body the way she was honest in all things, and he was careful and unhurried with her. And afterward she lay with her arm across his chest and her hand over his heart, listening to it, and he rested his cheek against her hair, and thought that the word home had more in it than the dictionary allowed. July moved into August and August into fall, and with the fall came the practical question, unspoken between them but present, of what the winter would mean and what the coming years would mean, and it was Mazoga who named it first because she was, as she had proven to be in all things, more willing to name the difficult thing than to live with it unnamed. "I am not leaving," she said one morning at the table. "I know," he said. "I want that to be a decision and not just a circumstance," she said. He looked at her across the breakfast things, this woman he loved wholly and clearly, and said, "Will you stay, not as a circumstance, as a choice?" "Yes," she said, "I am asking you the same." "Yes," he said, and it was the simplest and most complete conversation he had ever had, and they both went back to breakfast and it was settled. The settling of it had practical implications, because a woman staying on a man's homestead in the Grayville frontier territory was one kind of thing, and a man and a woman building a shared life was another kind of thing, and the territory had particular ways of recognizing the second kind of thing that conferred certain protections and rights. He drove to Grayville and filed the papers that made the homestead jointly held, and he filed them in both names, and when Aldous bent behind the trading post counter said, eyebrows lifted, "Both names, Harlan." Harlan said, "Yes, Aldous, both names," and that was that. There was talk, because there was always talk, but talk ran on fuel, and the fuel in this case was people expecting a scandal to develop, and the scandal not developing, because there was nothing in the life Harlan and Mazoga were building together that offered material for scandal, except the fact of the building itself. And even the most determined gossip eventually tires of a story in which nothing happens except two people working hard and clearly caring deeply for each other. Not everyone came around. Some never would. There were people in Grayville who crossed the street when they saw her coming, and people who would not trade directly with her, and one man, Corvin Stiles, who had drunk courage enough one afternoon in early September to say something directly to her face on the trading post steps that was ugly and specific enough that the three people who heard it went quiet and still. She looked at him for a moment, this man with his red face and his whiskey-sour opinion, and she said in her quietest and most measured voice, "You are afraid of me. I understand fear. It is less interesting than it looks." And she walked past him and went into the trading post, and Corvin Stiles stood on the steps with three witnesses to his diminishment, and Harlan, who had been at the wagon and had crossed the street at a controlled walk when he heard the voice, arrived at the steps a moment after she had gone in and looked at Corvin with a single long look that required no words. Stiles was less vocal after that. There were also people who surprised him, who came around slowly or suddenly. A woman named Petra Vance, who ran the small school and had a practical and unsentimental view of the world, struck up a conversation with Mazoga at the harvest market over the quality of Mazoga's preserved goods, and they discovered a shared and slightly combative opinion about the proper way to put up winter vegetables, and the conversation became a standing exchange, and Petra Vance became, over the following months, the first of what Harlan thought of as their real allies in the settlement. The harvest was good that year, better than any year Harlan had managed alone, and at the harvest market he and Mazoga stood at their table together with their goods spread out and the September sun on everything. And people came, and some looked at both of them, and some looked only at him, and some only at her, and some looked at them together, and understood what they were seeing, and most of those understood it without commentary. He put his hand on her back once during the market, briefly, the simple possessive warmth of it, and she leaned slightly into his side. And a pair of children who had been watching them from the corner of the next stall ran away laughing at some private game, and the day went on. October brought the anniversary of her arrival, which neither of them marked out loud but both of them were aware of. She had come to his fence line bleeding and standing on Will, and she was now standing in their yard in the October cold with her hair loose for once and her hands dirty from the kitchen garden's last harvest and the homestead around her like a place she had always been. And he watched her from the cabin step and thought about the year and everything it had contained and felt a gratitude that was too large and too textured for words. He made do with her name. Mazoga. She looked at him over her shoulder. "What? Nothing," he said. "Just making sure you were real." She gave him the full smile, the unguarded one, the one that was hers alone and that she gave freely now, and turned back to the garden. Winter came again, and this time it was different in every possible way from the previous winter, because the previous winter had been two people managing the cold in close quarters, and this winter was two people who were building something warm from the inside. And the cabin that had been too quiet for 5 years was full now of her voice and her laughter and her arguments and her reading and her particular habit of making herbal tea, and then forgetting it was hot and burning her lip on it every single time. And he had, in the previous year, gone from a man who lived with the sound of loss to a man who lived with the sound of life. In November, a trading party came through the Grayville territory from the eastern mountains, and among them were 2 orcs, a man and a woman, who were kin to a clan that had been allied with the warband Mazoga had served with before the merchant company's betrayal. She had not seen people of her own kind in over a year. He watched her go still when she saw them at the edge of the market, and then move toward them with a controlled casualness that fooled nobody and certainly not him. He gave her space, stayed at the wagon and watched from a distance as the conversation began cautiously and then warmed, the particular warming of people who share a language and a history. And when she came back to him, an hour later her eyes were bright and her jaw was tight with something that was not quite tears but was in the family of them. They knew of Urka, she said. They had heard of her. They said she was remembered. She looked at him and he went to her and put his hands on her face and she closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and then opened them and was steady. "She is remembered," she said. "Yes," he said, "she is." She nodded once, the deep nod of a thing confirmed and settled, and then she took his hand and they went back to the market because there were things to purchase, and the afternoon was moving and life went on in the way that life does, which is not without grief but alongside it. December, the second winter together. The snow that came on the 15th of the month was the biggest single snowfall Harlan had seen in 6 years at the homestead, and it kept them inside for 3 full days, and those 3 days were, in the accounting of his happiness, some of the best he had stored. She taught him a card game she knew from her years with the warband, which she claimed he would never beat her at, and which she was correct about, though he contested every hand on principle. She told him about the far eastern territories she had traveled through as a young woman before the war, when she had been 21 and curious about everything and afraid of nothing, and the picture she painted of those wild coastal lands was vivid enough that he could smell the salt in it. He told her about his childhood in the southern territories, the crowded, noisy farm where he had grown up, 7 siblings and a father who worked himself to the bone, and a mother who kept everything from falling apart by the force of her organizational genius. "You are like your mother," she said. He considered this. "That is the best thing anyone has ever said to me." She looked at him with the warm directness that was entirely hers. "I mean it entirely." "She sounds like someone who understood what was important." "She did," he said. "I would have liked to know her," she said. "She would have liked you very much," he said. She had no patience for small minds and a great deal of patience for capable people. She would have watched you fix that gate and she would have adopted you on the spot. Mazoga smiled at that, a warm and genuine one, and said, "That sounds like a good woman." "The best," he agreed, and they went back to the card game and she won again. Spring of the second year was different from the first spring in the way that second springs always are, which is that the urgency of surviving to them has been replaced by the pleasure of arriving at them. The columbines came up on the slope behind the cabin in their usual reckless abundance, and Mazoga, who had never seen them in full bloom, stood on the slope for a long time in the cold morning light looking at them, and he stood beside her because he wanted to see them as she was seeing them. "You buried her here," Mazoga said. "Yes," he said, "on the south-facing side where the sun comes first." "It is a good place," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the columbines, and then she said something in Orcish that he did not understand quietly in the direction of the slope. He did not ask what it was. It was hers to say. In April she told him she was carrying his child, in the same matter-of-fact way she said all the things that mattered most, just the fact plainly stated at the table in the morning with her hands around her teacup. He sat very still for a moment, and then he said, "Yes." And she said, "Yes." And he got up and went around the table, and she stood up, and he held her with his arms fully around her and his face in her hair, and he said nothing for a long time because nothing was needed. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice against his shoulder. "Terrified," he said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," she said, "but I know the difference between fear and danger. This is only fear." "Yes," he said. "This is only fear." They stood in the cabin kitchen in the April morning with the fire going and the spring sounds coming through the window and the world outside full of all of its wild, ordinary complexity, and they were both afraid and both completely certain, which is probably the only honest way to begin anything that matters. The pregnancy was not without difficulty. She was tired in a way she found humbling because she was not accustomed to her body's limits, and she was occasionally nauseated in the early months, and the summer was hot, and the homestead work was relentless. They adjusted. He took more of the heavy physical work without comment, and she directed the planning and the coordination with the particular competence she brought to everything structural. And the arrangement was efficient and honest, and she made clear once, precisely once, that she was not fragile and did not intend to be treated as such. And after that single statement he calibrated accordingly, which was to treat her as the capable person she was while ensuring that the heaviest work fell to him for the duration. She was extraordinary pregnant. He would have said this was his bias, except that Petra Vance said the same thing, that there was a quality to Mazoga in those months that was striking in the same way the mountains were striking, something large and sure and unmistakably alive. Her amber eyes were brighter, and her voice was, if anything, steadier, and she was building a cradle from a pattern she had worked out herself, and was executing with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything she built. Their son was born in November, which was the same month she had come to his fence line for the first time, and Harlan had considered pointing this out, and then decided that some coincidences were better held quietly than announced. He was born at the homestead with the help of Petra Vance and an older woman from the settlement who knew midwifery, and he was healthy and large and loudly opinionated from the first minute, and he had dark hair and his father's stubborn set of jaw, and his mother's amber eyes in a face that was entirely and originally his own. They named him Rowan, for the rowan tree at the edge of the yard that had been the first thing to green up each spring, because it seemed right to name something alive and new after something alive and persistent. The first months with Rowan were exhausting and extraordinary, and occasionally terrifying, and consistently the most present Harlan had ever been in his own life, because an infant in a frontier homestead does not allow for anything other than the immediate moment, and the immediate moment turned out to contain everything that mattered. Mazoga was a mother the way she was everything else, completely and practically, and with an absolute depth of love that was visible in every interaction, and watching her with Rowan was something that cracked Harlan wide open on a regular basis. He told her this one night when Rowan was 3 months old and finally sleeping for longer stretches and they were themselves able to sleep, and she listened to his saying it and looked at him in the low firelight with the tired and wholly present look of a person fully inhabiting their own life, and she said, "I was afraid I would not know how. To be a mother again. To let it matter," she said quietly. "After Urka. I was afraid that if I let it matter it would be taken." "Mazoga," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." She looked at Rowan in the cradle she had built. He matters completely. I have decided to be afraid and let him matter anyway." "That is the bravest thing I have ever heard," he said. She looked at him. "You let me matter," she said. "You let that happen before I knew how to stop it." "I am very glad I did," he said. "So am I," she said. "So am I." Rowan grew at the pace that children grow, which is to say faster than any reasonable physics should allow, and the homestead grew around him, and Grayville grew around all of them in the particular way that places grow around people who are clearly staying, which is that the edges of the hostility softened over time because they had nothing to sharpen on. Mazoga was present in the settlement with a consistency that prevented her from remaining a fear, and she worked at the harvest market and contributed to the road repair efforts, and once, in the 3rd year, pulled a child out of the Mill River with a speed and certainty that no one else present could have matched, and the child's mother, who had never acknowledged her before, looked at her on the riverbank with an expression that had no prejudice left in it, just one parent recognizing another. Not everyone. There were still people who would never be moved, and Harlan had made his peace with this because Mazoga had. "You cannot build peace with everyone," she told him once. "You build it where you can, and you do not require it of the ones who are not capable of it yet. You just keep building." He thought this was among the wisest things he had ever heard. The trading post changed hands in the 4th year, Aldous Bent retiring south to live with his daughter, and the new owner was a younger man named Garrison who came from the Central Territories, where the frontier had been open for longer, and where the mixing of peoples was considerably more ordinary. He shook Mazoga's hand the first time they met and asked her directly about the soil quality in the eastern fields because he had heard she knew the land, and she answered him with the directness she brought to people who were direct with her, and Harlan watched this from 2 feet away and felt something that was specifically happiness, specific and clear. In the 5th year, Mazoga received a letter through the trading post, carried by a traveling party from the east, written in Orcish characters in a hand she recognized as belonging to one of the 2 war band members who had escaped the merchant company's betrayal. His name was Brack, and he had survived and settled with a mixed clan community 3 days' ride south of the mountains, and he had heard she was alive through the trading networks that connected the frontier communities, and he wanted to say that he was glad of it. She read the letter 3 times and then folded it carefully and put it in the chest where she kept the things that mattered. Harlan did not ask her about it, and she told him about it that evening of her own accord, fully, because she had become a person who told him the things that mattered without needing to be asked, and he had become a person who was trusted with them. She wrote back to Brack, which took her 3 evenings because her writing in the common tongue was functional, but her Orcish script, which she had not used in years, came back slowly and then surely. Harlan sat at the table with her on all 3 evenings, doing his own work, present without intrusion, and on the 3rd evening when she folded the letter and set it aside finished, she looked up and he looked up and they looked at each other with the simple shared knowledge of people who have built something real. The 2nd child came 2 years after Rowan, a girl with her mother's amber eyes and her father's coloring, and they named her Mara, which was Harlan's mother's name, and Mazoga said this was the right name without any qualification. Mara was, from her first weeks, a person of tremendous opinion and decisive action, and Rowan, who was old enough to have opinions about the new intrusion into his world, came around to devotion within approximately a month. The children were themselves, which is to say they were half orc and half human, and entirely the specific people they were becoming, and Harlan and Mazoga raised them with the same practical honesty they brought to everything else, which meant that when Rowan came home at age 6 with the information that a boy at the settlement school had said something about his mother, Harlan took the information calmly and said, "What did you say back?" And Rowan said, "I said she could fix anything and also she knew the names of all the stars." And Harlan said, "That is correct on both counts." And that was the framework they built. The children knew who they were and where they came from, and they were given the tools to stand in that knowledge without apology. Mazoga taught them the Orcish words she remembered, working them back into fluency herself as she taught. And Harlan listened and picked up what he could and made Rowan and Mara laugh by mangling the pronunciation, which he did sometimes on purpose because he enjoyed the sound of his children laughing. The language came alive in the cabin on winter evenings and in the summer fields, a thread of something that had been at risk of going silent being kept alive by use, and this seemed right in a way that went beyond the practical. In the 7th year of Mazoga's time at the homestead, Harlan built a proper second room onto the cabin because the children had reached the age at which the single room was no longer adequate, and Mazoga did the planning for it. And it was better planned than anything he could have conceived alone, with a south-facing window that caught the winter light and a storage loft that she had figured out with the kind of spatial intelligence that was entirely hers. The summer they built it, working together and with 2 hired men from the settlement for the heavy lifting, was one of those summers that settles in the memory as a complete thing, warm and hard and full of real work and real progress, and the particular pleasure of a thing growing up out of your own hands. The hired men, who had arrived with a certain careful wariness about the situation, left at the end of the summer having had a thoroughly ordinary work experience with 2 thorough competent people who fed them well and paid them straight. And one of them, a young man named Dallow, told someone at Calden's that the Thunderroar Wallace homestead was the most organized operation he had worked on in 3 years. And this piece of information circulated in the settlement in the way that practical information circulates among practical people, with direct impact on practical decisions. In the 8th year, 2 families with mixed Orc-human heritage began settling in the Grayville district, drawn partly by the land prices and partly, it became clear in subsequent conversations, by the knowledge that the Thunderroar Wallace homestead existed and was stable and established. Mazoga received this information with characteristic directness, processing what it meant and then saying, "We have become a signal." Harlan considered this and said, "Is that all right?" She considered it in return and said, "Yes, I think it is." They had a dinner for the 2 new families in the fall, a real one, with the table extended out the door onto the wooden step, and the late-autumn light over the pasture and the children running in the fading grass, and the food that Mazoga had prepared with the full focus she brought to things she wanted to be good. It was, by any accounting, a fine evening. Petra Vance came, and Garrison from the trading post, and a few others who had over the years crossed the distance from cautious to genuinely friendly. The new family sat at the extended table and ate, and the children ran, and the stars came up one by one, and Harlan looked down the table at Mazoga in the lamplight, at her amber eyes and her laugh and her hands moving expressively in the middle of a point she was making to the woman beside her, and he thought about the man he had been sitting alone in this cabin, and the life that had been waiting on the other side of an autumn fence line. He reached out and touched her hand, and she turned to look at him with the full warmth of her attention, and he said, quietly, so only she could hear, "Thank you for not leaving in the morning." She looked at him with those eyes, 7 years of evenings in them, 2 children and a built room and a kitchen garden and a fixed gate and a shared name on a property filing and 1,000 evenings by the fire. "Thank you for not reaching for the rifle," she said. He turned her hand over and held it on the table in the lamplight, and Rowan came charging past with Mara chasing him, and the table moved slightly with the impact of their passing, and someone laughed at the far end, and the autumn night came down around all of them, warm and ordinary and entirely, exactly right. The years moved in the way that good years move, which is forward and full and punctuated by the specific moments that become the landmarks of a shared life. The winters they survived, and the springs they celebrated, and the summer when the creek flooded and they moved half the homestead to higher ground in a single frantic night, and the other summer when the corn was so good that Mazoga made a joke about it that became a family reference that the children were still using years later. There were hard times, because the frontier was not a place that permitted comfortable fiction about the nature of hard times, and there were losses, a horse, a hard winter that took old Petra Vance before her time, a summer drought that thinned the harvest, and they moved through all of it together with the particular solidity of people who have chosen each other fully and do not unchoose. Corvin Styles, who had said the ugly thing on the trading post steps in that first September, died in the 12th year, unremarkable, and was buried without ceremony and without eulogy that Harlan heard, and Harlan and Mazoga went about their day as they always had. The frontier remembered the people who built things and fed their neighbors and kept their word, and it largely did not remember the people who contributed only their small and frightened cruelties, and Harlan thought this was probably correct. Rowan, at 14, was a rangy, serious-faced boy with his mother's amber eyes and his father's steady patience, and an interest in land, surveying that Mazoga had deliberately cultivated over several years of practical discussion, having decided correctly that there would be people in the next generation of this territory who understood how land worked and how it was measured and how rights were established, and that those people should include her son. He was also, already, a natural mediator, the kind of person others brought their arguments to for perspective, and Harlan thought this was his mother in him, the quality of careful observation and the willingness to name the real thing. Mara, at 12, was everything she had promised to be from the first weeks, opinionated and quick and deeply loyal, and she had her grandmother's name and something of her grandmother's organizational genius, and she ran the household accounts with an accuracy that made Harlan slightly ashamed of his own previous bookkeeping. She asked her mother questions about the Orcish words and the Eastern territories and the history of the clans with an appetite that Mazoga fed without reservation, because she understood what Mara was doing, which was building herself a complete history rather than half of one, and this was the right thing to do, and she encouraged it. Harlan was 46 and Mazoga was 43, and the homestead was, in the 15th year, a genuinely substantial operation. The original cabin had the added room and a new roof, and a proper stone chimney that he had rebuilt from scratch in the 10th year. There was a real barn and a smithing shed and a storage building, and the kitchen garden that had grown from its original corner to a half-acre enclosed plot that supplied them through the winter and provided enough surplus to trade. The 2 pastures had been expanded and were reliably productive. The fence lines were straight and the gates swung true. They stood together on the step of the cabin on an evening in the 15th autumn and looked at it. Just looked at it, the way you look at things you have built over time, taking the whole of it in with the knowledge of everything that had gone into each part. The columbines were done for the year on the slope behind the cabin, their stalks brown and dry, holding the promise of next spring's riot. The rowan tree at the edge of the yard was brilliant red, as it was every fall, as reliable and exact as any calendar. 15 years, he said. Yes, she said. Mazoga, she looked at him. The amber eyes in the fall light were the same as the first day, deep and direct and fully present. There was more in her face now, more years and more weathering and the specific beauty of a person who had lived fully in themselves, and she was to him the most beautiful thing in the landscape and had been since February of the first year, when he had begun to see her clearly. I would do it all again, he said, every day. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she reached up and touched his face in the way she had touched it with the tentative question of the first kiss, but there was no question in it now, only knowledge, only the warmth of a complete and certain thing. So would I, she said, every single day. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his side, and they stood together on the step of the cabin they had built, and the land they had worked, and the life they had made with their own hands out of a cold autumn and a broken fence line, and two people who had each been, in their own way, a long way from home until they were not. The sun went down behind the pasture, and the first stars came out above the mountains, and the rowan tree held its red against the darkening sky, and the children's voices drifted from inside the cabin, and the homestead stood solid and real and entirely theirs. And the evening came down around them like a thing that belonged to no one and to both of them, and to the specific good country they had built in it. And it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.